Well, it's good to be here with all of you as we continue in the series, which I found really rich for my own spiritual life, and I hope also for all of you. Kindness. Kindness, the spiritual fruit of kindness. I wonder if we were to brainstorm what characteristics we would give to a mighty hero, the perfect hero we could imagine. What might we come up with? I think some might be obvious for a perfect hero. Someone who is strong, someone who's righteous, someone who's powerful, who is loving. Kindness. I wonder if kindness might not come to us right away, but might show up a little bit lower on the list. How important exactly is kindness? As I pondered it more this week, I realized how significant exactly are the acts of kindness, or if we were to think of the opposite, how powerful are the acts of meanness, unkindness in our lives as well. Many of you know some of the things going on for my family, and these days I have received many kind messages, email, and support. And some have been enough to bring a tear to my eye. Kindness is a very powerful thing. On the flip side, I think when we experience the opposite of kindness, perhaps something like being bullied at school, yelled at, mistreated, we see how painful and powerful an absence of kindness can be in our lives and stay with us for many, many years. And so in our series on the fruit of the Spirit, the scripture teaches us, and Paul teaches us, that there is a way of life that is full of the desires of the flesh, that is sinful, and we're listed things like enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger. And these are some of our sinful, more baser instincts. And I think we see in the world around us when kindness is absent. But instead of giving in to those desires and temptations, we are taught something else, to cultivate the life of God known as the fruit of the Spirit, to become more Christ-like. And this morning we think about that in one particular dimension, to be kind as Christ is kind. As I mentioned to the children, perhaps this has been popularized by Dr. Bonnie Henry, but we need to think about, is kindness a Christian virtue? How do we understand what kindness is? Well, and I began by thinking about what a dictionary definition would say. Kindness, the quality of being warm-hearted and considerate and humane and sympathetic. Also, the tendency to be kind and forgiving. Whereas perhaps as an antonym, the opposite would be a lack of sympathy around us. And so I'm going to be preaching and looking more at the gospel reading that we looked at this morning. And it's an interesting story, often known as Jesus anointed at Bethany. It's actually recorded in all four of the gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was seen as something important about who Jesus was and something that we can all learn for in this story. And I wonder, as we go through the story once again, what is it a story of? Is it a story of kindness? Is it a story of the opposite, some type of unkindness or meanness? I think we'll see as we go. And I think I've chosen Luke's account. There are four different versions that we could have looked at this morning, and we'll look at one other one a little bit. But Luke captures the story particularly masterfully. And he starts with kind of the most innocent and brief of description. So as we get into the story, let me remind you of the characters we have in this story. First, we have the Pharisees. The Pharisees were, you can imagine, a bit of the religious elite at the time. They were experts in the law. They knew exactly what it was to be a good Jewish follower at the time, someone who did everything religiously right, by the book, crossing every T and dotting every I. And they tried to keep the Jewish people in line, following God's law. Paul himself, who wrote about the fruit of the Spirit, was a former Pharisee, if you're planning that in your mind there. We have Jesus in our story, and he is invited to a certain gathering. We'll say more about that. Now, what we don't see in Luke's account, and we're going to jump around a little bit, Luke doesn't quite mention the disciples, but all three other stories do mention the disciples as they followed Jesus, were trying to learn from Jesus, and often gotten involved with what Jesus was doing. So we're going to see their role in the story. And our final character is someone simply called a woman. A woman. Now, she is given a descriptor. It says, a woman of the city who was a sinner. And you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? At that time, culturally, that would kind of be saying, oh, a woman of the streets. Often that meant someone who was a sex worker, perhaps a prostitute. And someone in Jewish eyes would have been seen as amongst the lowest of the low. And so it's interesting that although she plays a prominent role in the story, Luke doesn't even quite use a name, which I think is the way everyone else in the story would have seen her anyways. Here is a woman of the streets, someone dirty, someone lowly. These are the characters in which we hear about this encounter. So let's do a very, very brief recap. The whole premise of our story begins in a single sentence. One of the Pharisees asked him, that is Jesus, to eat with him. And he, Jesus, went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. The Pharisees and Jesus sort of had a bit of a relationship. You see that they called Jesus a teacher, that is a rabbi. They respected him to some extent. But they're always very curious to know a little bit more about Jesus. And as they got to know each other more, the relationship was actually becoming antagonistic. And often the Pharisees were finding some way to trap Jesus, prove he was fraud, or something like that. And so they invite him over, which is quite an intimate thing. I think when COVID ends, it'll feel quite a special thing to invite guests over for dinner. During this time, to invite someone over for dinner was a significant social arrangement. And there are certain types of etiquette that should be followed, especially if you invite someone of title and rank. That is, if you invite someone you consider a rabbi or teacher, you're actually saying you're higher than us. We're going to invite you as a guest of honor. And what we're told is that Jesus goes and reclines at table. In one sentence, the context is set up, but look what happens after this. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that Jesus was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with ointment. I don't know if you can imagine the most awkward social thing you've ever experienced in your life. This would be up there. Can you imagine there's some religious elite, they invited Jesus into the seat of honor, and someone who clearly looks like they're dressed from the streets or perhaps already has a reputation comes in weeping, opens up perfume, which fills the entire room. This is a scene. So what started as a simple sentence, Luke has suddenly dropped a bomb into the story of what's happening here. As one biblical scholar writes, everything about this woman is wrong. She does not belong here, and the actions she performs are inappropriate in any setting for someone like Jesus. When someone enters in with tears, that is a showstopper for everyone. As many of you know, in Middle Eastern culture, a woman should not reveal her hair. So not only is she weeping, she then uncovers her hair in front of however many people were there, at least Pharisees, disciples, perhaps others. And then this perfume she begins to pour on Jesus' feet, cleaning it. The story takes a real twist here. And so this bombshell happens, and everyone will have their own reaction to what happens here. First, the Pharisees react. And I included a couple drawings to try to capture here. This is the moment, and you can see the way the other faces are shrouded in shock and wondering, and I think there's even some judgment on some of the faces there. A Renaissance painter put it this way, and it showed the women showing a lot of skin, and in a way kind of trying to capture some of the backstory of how scandalous this would be. But everyone has a reaction to this. Now, the Pharisee who had invited him saw this and started saying to himself, wow, if Jesus was a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of women. Do you hear the judgment in that? What sort of woman would come here and touch Jesus, which is a big, big no-no in Jewish culture. If someone was seen as unclean, sinful, or lowly, should not touch a righteous, holy person. And so the Pharisees sort of self-righteous. I knew it. This guy is not a real prophet. Look at the things that he does. So the Pharisees have their own reaction to what happens here. The disciples also react, not in our story, but in Matthew chapter 26 recorded this. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. The disciples thought they knew how to be a good religious person. They've been following Jesus. Oh, Jesus cares for the poor. who is this woman? She's a mess, crying and in tears, uncovering her hair and pouring something so expensive on Jesus' feet. And so they react judgmentally as well. And dare I say, both the Pharisees and disciples have been unkind to this point. How will Jesus respond? Well, Jesus begins with a story. He looks at the Pharisees. Simon, I have something to say to you. And Simon answered, say it, teacher. Jesus said, a certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Jesus is brilliant, even in the strangest of situations. He knows sin is like a debt. It's something we have done wrong to God, we owe. And Jesus sort of saying, hey, there's multiple people who all owe. And someone might owe quite badly, but when they're forgiven it, what happens? And Jesus is sort of helping the Pharisees understand this is a woman who has been forgiven something incredible, is now showing great love. Now, which of them will love him more? But then Jesus continues. Now, let me go to the passage first. Then turning to the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. This is where the story breaks open for us as listeners to understand something serious has happened that can often be missed on us because we're of a different culture. If in Western culture, we're a very casual society now. We don't have a strict etiquette. But if you were to invite someone of great honor and rank to your home, you might greet them at the door as they knock and say, hello, John, it's nice to see you. And being a good guest, a guest doesn't just barge in and throw their jacket on a couch. Instead, a good host should say, wouldn't you like to come in? And then the guest, takes a step in, not too far into the house, but, and then the host might have a back and forth. Can I take your jacket? And the host might say, the guest might say, should I take off my shoes? There's all this etiquette that you do. And say if the host had a TV on, they would definitely turn it off to show that attention was to them. They might offer them a drink or things like that. So there's sort of different etiquette that happens. And if any of these didn't happen, it'd be seen as quite rude. If the Queen of England visited me and she was on my porch and I said, oh, hi, Queen of England, and I just paused and didn't invite her in, it would be seen as a huge insult, but only to people who understand a certain type of etiquette. And so in Western etiquette, if you were to break one of these, it would be seen as a social faux pas and incorrect. I was going to try to list some Cantonese ones, but again, our church, although a Cantonese background, has a mixture of cultures. But imagine if you invited someone very, very important to dim sum and you poured everyone tea except for that person. Or imagine if you invited someone to dim sum and when the bill came, you said nothing and you just waited. Okay, these would be some of the type of social faux pas that could happen instead of fighting for the bill as, maybe you should. But in Jewish etiquette, Jesus was bringing out that the Pharisees had already made a bunch of mistakes, done wrong, and actually had been incredibly unkind to Jesus. In Jewish etiquette, if you were to invite a guest of honor, when you come in, you should immediately greet them with a kiss. So when we think of Judas kissing Jesus, it should not strike us as an odd thing, maybe for us culturally now. But if you were to watch Italian or French culture, a kiss is a normal way to greet. And sometimes there's a certain way you do it, whether 2 times, 3 times, or things like that. In Jewish etiquette, if you were to invite a guest of honor over, you ought to greet them with a kiss. You ought to provide water to wash their feet. And olive oil might be used for them to anoint their hands or their feet and give a kind of a nice aroma and a sense of comfort for your guest. What Jesus says is, as this woman comes in and does these things, is that you Pharisees didn't do a single one of these kind acts of hospitality. And instead, this woman, who probably didn't come thinking, oh, they probably forget to wash his feet, and that in the spur of the moment thought, how can I show my love and kindness to this man, Jesus, this man who's called friend of sinners? And seeing what had been done so wrong in etiquette to Jesus, she weeps and realizes these tears can wash the feet that haven't been washed by the Pharisees. And maybe sensing the tension in the room, she thought, I will kiss the feet of the guest when he has not even been kissed as he entered as a guest. And if they have not anointed him with the most basic of olive oil, I will bring my precious gift and pour it on Jesus' feet. Do you see culturally what's happening in this story? And so Jesus has already responded quite harshly to the Pharisees. Do you see this woman? Do you understand what she did? I know you want to judge her. You want to look down on her. And I want you to imagine, nowadays in our society, we think a lot about cultural privilege and who has privilege in a different situation. I promise you, this woman is like the lowest rung below the floor level of privilege. To be seen as sinful, to be weeping, to be showing her hair in this moment. It would be easy for anyone to bully her in that moment and put her down. Instead, Jesus looks at this woman and recognizes the love and kindness of the action. So if kindness is something that humanizes, shows sympathy, is forgiving, then Jesus shows a beautiful act of kindness to rebuke the Pharisees. He rebukes the disciples as well. Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you trouble this woman? When the disciples are like, hey, this is a big waste of perfume. For she has done a beautiful thing to me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. So Jesus hints at his upcoming resurrection and that this woman has done something hugely symbolic and important. And so Jesus then responds to the woman. He says to her, your sins are forgiven. And those who are at the table began to say to themselves, who is this? Who even forgives sin? And Jesus says to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Someone who people wouldn't even want to look at, doing something despicable, unclean, showing her hair, all the wrong things that society. Jesus looks at her, speaks to her, and blesses her. Jesus was known as the friend of sinners, a title earned by the fact that Jesus hung out with seemingly all the wrong kind of people. And what we see in the story is Jesus' kindness towards the woman. After he rebukes the Pharisees, rebukes the disciples, he actually makes this promise. And you see this in the last 3 lines. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So over the last 2,000 years, this has been a story of a woman showing great love and kindness to Jesus, recognizing who he is. And even in those 2 paintings I showed you, people have reflected on this wonderful moment that something incredible happens. I wonder what you and I see in Jesus. When we think of a hero, we might want them to be mighty and strong and righteous. In God's case, someone who's able to create things, someone who's a great judge. But have you experienced the kindness of Christ? I think often we are tempted to think of God as a harsh judge. And when we mess up, he has his clipboard out, docking marks off of us. The kind of God we dare not even look up to. God, I messed up again. Sorry, I'm just not a very good person. I don't know how to do this being a good person sort of thing. Do you know that Jesus is kind? And this woman, in her greatest moment of vulnerability, before these teachers of the law, before all these people, she's a mess, crying, showing her hair, doing all these things, that she's not met with judgment or rebuke from Jesus. She is met with the kindness of Christ. I wish I could say I was always kind. I am tempted by my ulterior motives. The Pharisees had ulterior motives to trap Jesus. I'm tempted by my judgmentalism, which the disciples had plenty of. We like to do things religiously proper. And it's easy to put someone else down. It makes us feel good. That's why bullies bully. What we see in our story, and as we're challenged to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, is to see the overwhelming kindness of Christ in this amazing moment, and to know that kindness is there for you and I. And it is a life-changing kindness, and we will learn to be kind as we encounter the kindness of Christ. Amen.